For this next session of the Future of the American Child Fellowship Program, we're going to be moving into the realm of child welfare. Now, whether you think of child welfare as foster care or child welfare or family policing, whatever side you fall on, I think it's pretty clear that vulnerable children and families in America need support. And so with that in mind, about 3 months ago, I read an op-ed that had run in the New York Times, and the title was, "I will never forget that I could have lived with people who loved me." And it was shortly after we knew we were going to be doing these fellowships. And it moved me so much, quite literally, it took my breath away. Shortly thereafter, I interviewed someone down in Texas who said, "You got to talk to Sixto. You got to talk to Sixto Cancel." And so I am absolutely thrilled that Sixto Cancel is able to join us tonight. He is the president and founder of an organization called Think of Us. And you've had some time to look at the materials I sent you and go to the link for Think of Us. But what the bottom line you should take away from meeting Sixto Cancel is the power of lived experience in coming up with innovations and solutions to most of the pressing problems that we have in this country. So Sixto, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine to be here with you all today. I literally wanted to get on a plane, be here with you all, because I feel like storytelling and narrative is one of the most powerful things in this country to understand where should we go. And so all of you are part of what narrative do people believe about this topic. And we're just living in a very unique time where narrative has a huge role to play in what happens next in our field.
Now, you just recently came back from, was it Vancouver, where you did the TED Talk?
Yes.
And you're going to talk about this in your presentation, but tell us a little bit now about the Audacious project.
Yeah, so Audacious is a very unique opportunity where you get to submit some of your craziest ideas and say, what is something very audacious, out of the box, which seems impossible? If someone's not criticizing you for the idea, then you kind of failed at being truly audacious. And then the question is, how do you have catalytic funding to do so? And so we were one of 10 organizations. We were able to raise in that process over $50 million. 47 was the official number that came out. And that will be used over the next 5 years for us to really lean into how do we accelerate some of the change that's happening right now in child welfare. And when it comes down to systems change, it's not about us scaling a program from state to state, from community to community. It's about how do we truly lean in and understand what are the games of the rules? How do you switch the games of the rules? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few.
I think you'll benefit so much from meeting Sixto tonight. One of our speakers, first thing tomorrow morning, is here with us, Fred Woolson. And then on Tuesday, you'll hear from the commissioner for the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families. I'm confident you're going to walk away from this training with a deepened sense of the urgency of innovation, transformation, whatever you want to call it, in terms of improving the outcomes for children who have to be removed from families or whatever. But I wanted to ask you one question before we get into your presentation, and that is, tell us a little bit more about your background a little bit now in terms of that pivotal point that you came to when you said, I've got to forge my own path and go forward.
Yeah, I think one of the very interesting benefits that I got was there are a lot of folks who are empowered to be advocates in our sector. And in our sector of child welfare and in foster care, there is a pathway to become an advocate. But what happens is you turn 30 years old, you get some hair on your side of your face, and then people are like, you're too old to be on the panels. You can't share your story anymore, right? And so from a younger age, when I was going into college, there was this moment where a lot of the people who had lived experience in foster care, who had helped pass things like the Chafee Bill, Fostering Connections Act, which extended foster care, I had admired them and like was watching them. And then it just started to feel like everybody was kind of losing their mind, right? Because you turn 30 and then all of a sudden your whole life is upended because you're too old to be on the panels, you're too old for the foundations to fly you out. You're being noted as too distant from the problem now, and therefore you're then isolated. And so I became very concerned about like what was my true contribution. And I'll talk a little bit in the presentation about where that moment happened. But once I realized I need to have a true contribution, I realized I need to get the other skill sets. And so that's when I leaned into technology. I leaned into data, how to build software, how do you think about systems change, and really understanding those very concrete things like how things are financed, how rules and policies are dictating a young person's life. And the foster care system is so interesting because you can have about 17 professionals who are making decisions about your life. A social worker supervisor, a judge, a probation officer, a therapist, a psychiatrist, the foster parent. Maybe there's 2 foster parents, maybe 1, right? And I can go on and on about all the voices where decisions that usually were between 1 or 2 people are now in a bureaucratic flow of up to 17 folks.
Well, at that note, I'm going to let you take it away, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Oh, awesome. So I thought I would like start today's presentation and be a little bit more on the casual side because
Thank you.
it's a small group. And so the first thing I wanted to do was kind of share how I've come to the work and a little bit about my personal narrative with the hopes of the learning objective of really trying to get a sense of what does it mean to be in foster care as a life longer, and specifically for those who are teenage and up. For those who are teenagers in the foster care system, your chances of going back home start to diminish significantly. So my story really begins before me, but I'll start with me. When I was 11 months, I was put into the foster care system. By the time I was 6, I got to return to my biological mother. Now, my mother had struggled with her mental health, but mainly with substance abuse, which was the factor that kind of had us come into the foster care system in the first place. At 6, I got to live with her and then some of my siblings. But at the age of 7 is when, once again, I found myself like hidden in the neighbor's, kitchen cabinet. Like it looked like a hostage situation. Like you had police cars all the way up and down the block. And then they finally gave her a choice, which was either you go to rehab and you sign your children over to the foster care system, or you're going to jail. And so my case on paper looks like a voluntary placement, but how voluntary is that situation? So lesson number 1 here, and I can give a few examples throughout the presentation, is that we collect data in our sector and we have our data reports, but everything needs to be questioned because there's a lot of nuance in how that data is being collected and then being reported out. If you look there, you would be wondering, why are so many mothers giving up their children, right? And there's much more nuance to it. By the time I was 9, so at 7, I was back in foster care. By the time I was 9, I was adopted. And that adoption was very racist, very abusive. While the other kids got to go to private school, I was told because I was Black, I had to go to public school. While they had rooms, I slept in the attic. There was a difference between what was going on. And then finally at 13 is when I started to realize like the abuse wasn't normal, the things that were happening weren't normal. And I started to push back a little bit. And I ended up couch surfing with these folks' parents for about 2 years. And it wasn't until I was watching Law and Order that I realized like I had to get the evidence of what was happening. Like I had to collect data. And so I started journaling. I started to be able to like record some of the abuse. And eventually, like sometimes the recordings would be caught, sometimes I would lose all the things. But eventually I was able to get enough evidence that I ended up back in the system and before a judge. And what was interesting about that moment was that when I was before that judge, they weren't that nice to me. And I was so confused why. And, the judge goes to me like, if this placement, I had found a church member to go live with. And she said, if this placement doesn't work out, best to believe you'll be in another foster home. And I looked at her and I was like, and that will be okay. My lawyer was like, calm down. Uh, don't get crazy with her now. But what I realized about the situation was because Connecticut is a two-party state, none of those recordings were actually brought to court, right? None of the stuff that I had gathered was actually admissible. And so there was this case that, on paper it looked like multiple open and closed investigation, a bunch of accusations, the things that had happened for those 2 years. But what made it to the front desk wasn't actually the story of what was actually happening. Despite the fact that I had, to this day, I have the actual recordings, right? Despite the fact that I had that, nowhere in the legal procedure was that able to come forward. And so like the truth hasn't been able to ring in a legal sense in so much of what has happened in my life. When I came back into foster care, I was 15 years old. And, I really thought that that was like the end of, the storm, but it was the beginning of the next storm. And that next storm was preparing to age out. I had made up in my mind, I had come to the conclusion like family was not going to be the thing, right? Everything that I had read, all of the other young people I had been in connection with, I saw them aging out. And so the idea that like you got 3 years of high school left and you're gonna magically find a family that's gonna like keep you after, I was like, I'll take my chances with the preparation. And so leaned into being able to be prepared with the financial literacy classes, the asset trainings around buying a car, having an apartment. And by the time I graduated high school, I had those things. But what was significant about my high school years is that I joined a youth board at the Department of Children and Families. And in that youth board, I got to really think about how do you improve a system. And at that time, I was really focused on the process of improvement. And so where could you make things better in a system, right? And got to do things like, pass a siblings bill for the right to visit your siblings. I got to create in 2008, it was the recession. And I realized like only 3% of young people were going to college. And so like my teenager brain was like, the answer must be SAT prep. That is like the barrier to like get into college. So let's work on that thing. And at the time, people were like, there's no way it's going to get funded. It's a recession. And, I got my teachers at my high school to volunteer, got social workers from the entire southwest part of Connecticut to drive young people in. And that first year, ran the program in a volunteer, like everyone volunteered. And then the second and third year, the actual state funded the one piece there. I went to the state and I was like, you have two choices. You can pay $4,000 or $8,000. And they laughed, obviously, because it's like, wait, what? That's nothing. And ended up actually funding all of the teachers who were acting as tutors, after school for that program year round. And then ended up being able to be picked up by one of the foundations, the Annie Casey Foundation. And that's where I just learned so much. How are multiple programs implemented across different states? The power of being bipartisan, right? Operating in red and blue states, how the system is financed. And so here I was as like this 18, 19-year-old learning so much and starting to fly all over the country and being able to participate in the backdoor conversations on Capitol Hill, in a state jurisdiction, I mean, you name it, and different campaigns. And then I went to the Clinton Global Initiative University, which is a 3-day summit. And at this summit is when I was in this room with 1,000 young people. And I have ADHD. So the way this works is that I need to sit in the front of the room. And so I go to the front of the room, I sit down. Maybe I should not have been sitting in that row, but I did. And while I was there, I asked the kid next to me, so what's your commitment of action? Because everyone has to come to this summit and do a commitment of action to solve a problem within a year span or have significant increase, or you don't come back. And so he's like, oh, this is my second year. And I was just like, oh, so what did you solve? And he's like, well, my community used to have a couple of months of famine. And so I came to the States, learned some best practices around farming. I couldn't be the one to deliver that knowledge to my village. So I found different champions and made it their idea. And then had a bunch of bake sales and used that money as gas money to subsidize the trade between 3 villages and solve famine in a year. And I was like, damn, you're special. I was like, I sat next to the right one. But then I talked to the kid next to me, to the left of me, and I was like, what's your commitment of action? And he's like, I've always wanted all of my sisters to be able to go to school. But in my culture, having to take care of the household is the number one priority. And so my sisters go to the river every morning, and they cannot go to school on time, so therefore they are not allowed to go to school because they have to take care of this. So his solution to this was he invented a plastic polymer, made a wheelbarrow thing for a 9-year-old to be able to push a mile and a half to the river, put water in it, get back in time to be able to go to school. And so that was his commitment of action. And at that moment, I knew I got invited to the wrong party. Because then they asked me, what do you do? And I'm like, I've shared a sad story. And like, at that moment, I quit everything. And I quit everything because I was like, what is my true contribution? And at this point, all I've seen is that the sector has been able to do something really well, which is empower those who use their ability to be able to go ahead and share a story or to empower an agenda. But the question was for me is like, where are those with lived experience who have the policy chops and the experience in the backdoor conversation, right? And I didn't see too many folks. And so that's when I said, okay, let me go on a journey. And the journey was to start Think of Us. And at the time, our design question was, how can I influence 1,000 workers' behavior across county lines, across state lines, and not announce a new reform? Because our sector is notorious for like new commissioner, new campaign, new reform. And that lasts all about 18 months, and then, the next one comes. And what I discovered in that year-long process of talking to people, digging in, was this thing here, which is that part of the way that the problem is being held in place is software. And this is an actual screen from California's software system. But what I started to realize is that the compliance-based culture of our sector is so dominated by the reporting lines to the courts that if there was a question in here that said, what was under the child's bed? You would have social workers the next day, if they had to submit that thing to the courts, looking on the children's bed. And so the power of software and what it kept culturally in place for compliance reasons, I was like, there's something here. And I thought to myself, well, what if technology and these type of interfaces weren't just in the hands of the actual caseworkers? What if it was in the hands of young people and the adults in their life and bio parents? And now you'd have the ability to collect input from so many different stakeholders, which means it's new data, it's new information. And so we built this platform. We built too wide, so we had some learning lessons there, like 7 modules. And one of the things that we started to learn was just like there were crazy things that we were able to see. So first of all, we piloted in one county, and we started to see how there were workers who would have different reactions to males versus females, how they would pipeline, how they would take twice as long to make it a goal for a female to live on their own, and yet we knew from the budget tool that females had a higher savings account, right? And so we were able to see these discrepancies. And then we saw discrepancies around race, right? And how certain folks got pipelined to more workforce opportunity versus educational opportunities because they may have been a black male, according to the data that we saw, right? And at this point, I'm 23, and most of the company at that point was like in their 20s. So we go flying and hot into places, being like, here are the workers who are racist, you should fire them. Which I learned you don't do. It's a little longer conversation than that. And plus the jurisdictions didn't know that we were collecting this type of data. They had no idea. They thought it was like the cute foster care kid app, like sure, we'll test it. Had no idea that we could see all of these things and how people were showing up. But what we realized in that, about 2.5 years in, is that the problem was much more pervasive than technology could solve. Because technology is about optimizing, one of the uses of technology is like optimizing to a place faster. And so what we realize is that the problem is actually truly systemic, right? And so if you think of these are the 6 elements that keep a system outcome in place, you have your policy, you have your practices, you have how money is spent. And everyone talks about those things, right? But underneath the surface, imagine this is like an iceberg, there's the power dynamics that exist to be true. There's relationships and connection. There's mental models. So at one point in our country, right, we came up with the idea that if children have, there's a judge and a social worker who have the power to remove a child from their home. At one point, there was a thought that, a judge should be involved, a social worker should be involved. And rules were created to do that. Funding does that. There's a certain power that's delegated to do that. and who gets to have a say in that, right, is there. Now there's a trend around kinship care, family members stepping up. And so people's mindset about family members are changing and their ability to take care of children. And so now people are trying to make different rules, different funding decisions, and so forth. So these are the 6 elements that keep a systemic outcome in place. And what we realized is that we needed to switch to this. And that's a little bit about the dollars that we were able to get. We didn't come up with a perfect, here's our 5-point plan for expansion and so forth. What we actually did, which I feel like, some folks thought we were crazy, is that we went to really, people who can invest a lot of money and said, do not fund us in the traditional way of a 5-point plan. There are a lot of people in this sector who are doing amazing things and could benefit from our organization being able to lean in with technology, being able to lean in with data, being able to lean in with, co-designing with people with lived experience, and then acting as a feedback loop to the federal ecosystem, Congress, White House, and the federal agencies. And so where we're at is at this huge moment where we believe there's kind of like 3 things that can really happen, and truly 2 that are at a pivotal point, which is the foster care system has played the major function of screening children in or out of foster care, right? And for the purposes of abuse. 63% of those children are in foster care, quote, documented as neglect cases. And there's some complexity there. There's always more to the story, as you all know, than what the reports will always say, right? And then less than 20% are there for, or documented, quote, for abuse. Sometimes some of those neglect cases, you can't prove the abuse, so neglect is involved. But what's important to know, and Fred's in the room from Chapin Hall. Chapin Hall does a lot of amazing work, and their research has found 85% of the families who have a child welfare involvement actually are making less than $50,000 a year, 200% of the poverty line, right? And so then we look a little deeper, and 37% of all families who have a child welfare involvement are making less than $11,000 a year. So this means that what we're actually dealing with here is we got the wrong kids in the wrong system. We don't have a system to deal with chronic poverty that ends up jeopardizing the future of a child. And so what we've actually pipelined children to is the foster care system. But the question is should there be something different? And during the Trump administration, there was some legislation passed that's called Family First. By no means is this the holy grail, but by no means it's not a big deal either. 2 things can exist at the same time, right? And so what that legislation did was it said, hey, you can use some funding to serve families if they're at risk of coming into the child welfare system. It's my interpretation, and I'm not a scholar, but I'm going to go here. It's my interpretation that this is giving child welfare a part of a new mandate, where the primary mandate for such a long time has been, hey, screen children in or out of foster care better and better and better. Now you have this different function of provide resources so that families are able to stay together and a removal is not doesn't need to occur. That to me is the beginning of a new part of a new mandate for the system, which is really freaking exciting. Then there's a trending phenomenon right now that's happening around kinship care. And kinship care is when a biological family member, or what people are calling a fictive kin, don't start me on the terminology, I'm just reporting out, a family friend, someone who's trusted by the child, someone who already loves the child, already connected to the child, where they are able to raise their hand and step up. And some of the new pending regulations would enable states to create a kin-specific process where you wouldn't have to go through the 10 weeks of a foster care kind of licensing training program. And then you could have alternative things like maybe it's just a background check and a walkthrough of your home and you can place a child on day 1 and be able to draw down some federal dollars. States would have to still do some of those things. The point I'm trying to make here is that these 2 parts of the system are in such an inflection point of things needing to be designed, implemented, and codified. And what that presents to us is an opportunity, in my opinion, is to have what I call the smartphone effect. The smartphone came up, the design for the first smartphone was not how do we make a better phone. People like Megan Smith and Andy and those, they were in a little shop and they were thinking about how do we connect the world more than ever before. And apps used to be called communities. That's why the first apps were people running and comparing their running things together, right? And what the smartphone did was it added so much value, right, that it almost made the flip phone obsolete. There's still a role for a flip phone, but it almost made the flip phone obsolete. And so if we could wave a magic wand, and it's a big if, and prevention was implemented in such a way, kinship was implemented in such a way where it's easier, better. We know when kids are placed with kin that there's some really big benefits like less moves, better mental health, things such as 67% of young people in one study who were placed with kin graduated high school on time versus those who were placed in a foster home with one group home experience, which graduated at 35% on time, right? And so if we can have enough of this system built, we can have new value there. Like it adds so much value that becomes the new default of the system, right? And so I'm excited about those things. And then the question becomes, now there has been about 40-ish years of work that has been done around older youth, from supporting them, thinking through what works and what doesn't. How do you monetize that, right? How do we take all those learning lessons and then say truly, what's the tipping point of pushing that forward? And so I think we're at a point where we can really make some significant strides in these first two buckets and then really codify what we've learned for almost the last 40-ish years, over 40-ish years in the older youth space. Now, is there an opportunity to put some bold, crazy numbers on top here? Yes. And anybody who knows anything in our fields about data will go ahead and question and be like, that seems a little crazy. And that is the point. Could we have a North Star that over the next 5 to 7 years that states really work towards, reducing 50% of the entries that are due to poverty? In Indiana, they've been able to cut their system in half, and so has New Jersey, and that was in about 5-year periods. In Indiana, I looked at the month-by-month data. It's always been between 8 and 11% reduction, right? And they did things like get a nonprofit to focus in on, instead of bringing that child in, what that nonprofit to sign on a per diem basis to work with that family to get whatever that family needs to be able to reduce their entry into care. The problem that I see, or not the problem, excuse me, the concern I have with some of the interventions that we're bringing about is, are they doing enough to change the trajectory of a life family or just enough to keep them out of the system? And we have to start asking ourselves those questions, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I really just don't know. Could 80% of those who come into foster care live with kin? There are some counties in New Jersey, after three years of working, that New Jersey has been able to get as high as 85% of their children placed with the family member or someone that the child already knew. So there are use cases and pockets of it, right, that are happening across the country. And so how might we actually go ahead and continue to think through being bold enough to say, hey, could we get to these in a lot of different places? And so one of the things of where we decided how to tackle the problem is kind of what we're seeing, how we'll spend our time over the next 5 years, which is doing work in these 3 buckets. I've explicitly said this is productively inaccurate because we're still drafting and we're still tinkering with things. But as an organization, it's like, instead of telling you all the different departments, basically we have 3 buckets of big work that we're doing. The research and understanding. So one is, we know that lived experience is a very important part and we need to hear from people with lived experience. But the question becomes, how does it go from one story to stories at scale so that you can understand across different county lines, across different state lines, what's a systematic problem? What is the evidence that this constitutes a jurisdiction level change at the state, county, or national level, right? And specifically, there are people who do a lot of great work in research, so we're not trying to do what they're doing, but we're hyper-focused on hearing directly from impacted young people. And then, once we identify some of those pain points, it's like, how do we reframe the understanding? Sometimes we have accepted an understanding from year after year, decade after decade, but it's much more nuanced. Second is, how do we design and implement different stuff? So one is sometimes when a state is trying to do something, there's probably someone who's solved it. There's very little times that no one has ever done something about a problem. You gotta find those people, so we scout for them, right? Find out who's already figured out how to solve that issue, and then help them scale up or help them bring them to that problem. Sometimes you do have to ideate, and so we have examples of that. And then sometimes, so once you get there, then we call it codifying, right? how do you replicate in enough places to know that like that intervention just didn't work because of the community dynamics in 3 or 4 places, but that it works in rural and it works in urban. It works in, you know, places that have a limited amount of support around social services and places that have a lot of social supports and so forth. And then once you figure out that beautiful balance, how do you upgrade the actual laws, regulations? And so we have quite a bit there. So I'm gonna just give quick examples because I wanna get to the meat of stuff later. So we're calling a lot of this work lived experience data, information that comes directly from those impacted. During the pandemic, we were able to go ahead and collect. Now today, our database holds 40,000 different current and former false youth in our database who have shared different needs data, things that they have needed. But when we started off, Congress was like, everybody, and this was the beginning of the pandemic, everybody's in trouble. Why should foster youth get any special support? Where's the evidence? So we put out a micro cash grant and we asked about 40 questions. And we had young people from all over the country. In each of these, you'll see, in each of these counties who responded to us. And what we were able to do with that data was then share it back with those congressional members to say, this is why our false youth need help. And amongst many other advocacy efforts and our effort, Congress passed $400 million to be able to go ahead and be pandemic-specific funds for current and former foster youth. And some of that data started off like this. This is just an Excel sheet. We asked people what they needed $1,000 for. We asked a bunch of multiple choice questions, but we also asked a bunch of different open-ended questions. And what we found were people would tell us so much about their situation. So we did things like word frequency, not rocket science, right? So we then had a town hall with the Trump administration, and like we said, here are the top 10 words that came up: food, housing, and so forth. And this was on the March 13th was the National Emergency Declaration. March 19th, we had a town hall with the administration, and this is what we heard, right? And we were able to go ahead and bring that forward so that then people can act. And what was powerful was that it wasn't like our actions after that. It was like everybody on the local level who were taking very serious actions to make sure like young people had food, young people had housing, and so forth. We were able to go ahead, this was some of the multiple choice data looked like. So then we were able to build some simple dashboards that allow people to go ahead and do this. So one of the things that we did while we were doing this is that we took the liberty to ask some other questions, right? Like, have you ever had a failed adoption? Did you get, a transition meeting? And so when we were able to get some of that data, it enabled us to actually also work with reporters. And so USA Today did a segment on adoption, and I think it was about 12, 15 different articles. But we were able to actually like see that out of the 27,000, we had 15%, 4,198 young people who had a failed adoption, and currently were in like a bad situation after. And we were able to not like give individual data, but at the aggregate level, stuff that looked like this, to that reporter. And that reporter was able to go ahead and then go down that thread, and like 13, 14 articles later, like had a whole segment to the point it was actually on the front page of the USA Today. I say US Times, don't tell them I said that. I'm about to be blackballed for no reason, y'all. So like the data directly from people is like really important, because what it did in this case was it allowed her to like go down these different threads and start pulling stuff and start to investigate and bring forward really big holes and issues in the system. And so some of that is like interviewing, some of that is the survey type data, some of that's getting in the room with young people and really running these workshops where they've been able to do things like this notion where we kept hearing from people who were like, young people who are aging out have no supportive adults. So then we went to 5 jurisdictions and then said to young people, let's start mapping out your network. And what we found was that young people did have supportive adults, but they would hide them from the system. That they would have those supportive adults, but it was an underdeveloped relationship, because you had all these paid adults that you go to say, okay, you're my employment specialist, I need you to help me with my resume. So now when stuff hits the fan and I'm 19 on my own, I'm engaging some of my mentors and adults the same way I would engage staff. And you can imagine like that probably doesn't go so well, right? So there were so many complications and things that we've learned as that. We learned that staff ended up being such a central anchor point in a young person's life, because a lot of these developmental, meaningful experiences were being had with them. So the research goes beyond just like survey data. It goes beyond just being able to like do this, interviewing data. It's also some of the workshops that we've been able to do there. And then we like hear very powerful things like this young person who said like all I ever wanted was for a family, but I was told I was too old, so I was kept in a group home until I aged out. I wasn't given the necessary things or resources to survive once I got out, and I got kicked out of my program for not being productive enough because I lost the will to live because I didn't know what to do with my life now that it was my own. Quick example of like the second bucket. So when Congress released that $400 million, 3 months later, we were still getting young people telling us, you act like, it was crazy. When 27,000 young people tell you what they need, best to believe they will follow up. And they kept telling us like, we haven't seen any money. You announced that Congress did this thing. So 3 months later, we were just like, what in the world is happening? And so we start talking to states, and states are telling us, well, we haven't had this thing called the program instructions, which tell them how to spend the money. And the new administration was coming in, so they needed to appoint a commissioner, and so like that was holding it all up. And there was someone in the administration, in a career staffer who could have pressed the go button, but he didn't. And I will forever hold that against him. But one of the things we realized is that states needed support. And so what we did was we started talking to folks, and what they needed was basic things like one website across the country where anybody can go to that was designed by people with lived experience and for. And this is like common sense, right? Like in business, what do? You engage the freaking clients and your consumers to understand how do you speak to them. So this is not like rocket science, y'all. I wish I was like a mad genius, and I would tell you I'm not. Like it was just like create one place where everybody in the country can go to and understand if they're eligible or not, and then apply there. We created a bunch of social media tags. We took our branding off of stuff so that local people can, it was important for local people to have the credit, but it was also important because local folks are actually the ones that the young people are tied to. And so there was this moment where we realized we couldn't just go ahead and start making new relationships, especially with 27,000 kids. And then the relationship belonged at the local level where people could be activated a lot more. So we learned how to be able to go ahead and say, how do you support folks on the ground level by like writing the emails, showing them what the action days are, showing up virtually to their action days and saying, this is how we're gonna run it. And then we were able to find over 30,000 young people and connect them to 44 states. We were able to iterate on that application with young people over and over to the point where we got 95.5% completion rate on a consistent basis. We were able to go ahead and be the official portal for 24 states. So that's a bit about how we design. And then codifying, we really have been focused on how do we act as the feedback loop to the federal agencies and to Congress now. And to the White House. So in the beginning of this administration, we would meet every single Friday with a briefing. Now we meet every other Thursday. And we get to just be like, here are the things that are happening, here's what we're seeing, and here's what we need action. And some of the fruitful stuff that has come from that has been things like an IRS letter. This might sound very boring, but this was a very big issue. False youth across the country got these stimulus checks, whether it had been on the state level or the federal level. But what it did was it put them right above, for some, right above the moment where they would lose all their benefits. So now you're actually at risk of losing your Section 8 voucher. Now you're at risk of losing your food stamps. And so what we were able to do was actually get the White House, work with IRS. Danny Davis's office was instrumental in being able to lift this and push pressure on it and get a letter out that's saying it's not taxable money, y'all. So that was instrumental in making sure young people can stay housed and so forth. Alrighty, so that's a little bit about what we're doing. But what I really am excited to talk about is this here. It's the media. So as I was thinking about this, I was like, what is important to know? And I kind of boiled down to these three things. Number one, it's like, I think that we as a sector have a framing problem. And so I want to start off with the framing problem that we have. We tend to talk about foster care as 400,000 children who are in foster care at any given time. And the problem with that is that, where it comes from, let me say, is that literally, our data is so bad in our sector that there are twice a year where we count the number of kids in care. So there's not real-time data, right? Now we know we have about 200,000 children who have some type of engagement with the child welfare system, and then at any given time about 400,000. So every year we engage about 600,000 children. Now, there's another way to look at this problem. 33% of all parents, or all families that have a child, before their child's 18th birthday will experience a child abuse investigation. 33%. That is a lot more Americans than less than 1 million, right? And then let's go deeper. 53% of all Black families will experience a child abuse investigation before their child's 18th birthday. 53%. 10% of all Black children will experience foster care. And 1 in 7 all of Native American children will experience foster care. So what we're talking about is, like, we've thought about this problem in a different way. There's one study that Nick just released that showed that 86% of the runaway young people that they, that they were able to engage with in this study, 86% of them had foster care experience. When you look at studies that have come out of Riker and some in LA, you're looking at north of 60 to 70% of those populations who are in prison, as adult prison, that they had foster care experience. So what we're talking about at the center of a lot of our biggest challenges in this country, whether it be sex trafficking, whether it be incarceration, whether it be underemployment, that you have foster care being one of the experiences that people are having in these very negative places, right? And so I just wanted to name that. I think that there's some work to do around the framing of how big or not big this problem is. And what this dictates is how much philanthropy is willing to invest and how big of a problem they see it is, how much government's willing to invest, right? And so I feel like there's an invisible population, and I am so curious to understand even more about what is actually the scope of the child welfare system on a yearly basis, right? We know that there are 3.5 million reports of child abuse a year, right? What is the impact on the ground? What is the impact of a child abuse investigation? There are some studies that are showing that it has some negative harm, but I think we have a lot to learn there. And so when I was thinking about the power of the media, I was like, look, we keep telling the story in this way that feels niche, right? And that feels like it affects a certain population. But what most people don't realize is that it could be you. And if you are a person of color, to hell, it's most likely going to be you who experiences a knock at a door before your child's 18th birthday. And so how do we start to tell that story differently? And the implications of telling that story differently, I think, has an implication on how we have political will around it. The second thing that I really did some thinking around was the role of the media and how it plays a significant role in influencing what governors and commissioners and people are forced to pay attention to. When a child dies, it's a very reportable situation. We see it on the news, right? And people are like, how did this happen? X, Y, Z. And so for me, it's just like, when I think about those moments, I think about how another example is like when children are sleeping in the offices, very easy to report on, people report on that, right? But there's so much more complexity, right? And so there are folks who have been writing a lot about children sleeping in offices and making it about group homes. So now we have certain folks who are manipulating, I feel like, stories to make it about a political agenda around keeping group homes around, and I'll share a little bit more on that later. But that we see that these kind of things actually end up forcing governors and commissioners to pay attention to that niche issue, when what's needed sometimes to actually fix that issue is so much deeper, right? We know that when you believe in kin and have an easier way to place with kin, that, hey, there's more placements available. What about your recruitment process of foster parents is so broken that kids have to sleep in the office? But what's reportable and what's been being brought up are these kind of headliners. And the implication of that is that now you force, not you all, but what's being forced by the community and by the public is attention to solve the niche issues instead of what really needs some deeper, kind of uprooting of some of the workflows and practices that are there. And then I would say is that when commissioners, like we have seen commissioners have been outed because of negative press, even if they've been really good. And so like the ability of not being able to share the full scope of the story that we've seen sometimes. And there have been some places, like some places are nicer than others, but there are some places in this country that are very vicious. And we have seen the media like literally be one of the reasons why a commissioner who was having significant progress no longer be there. And so when I think about the power of story sharing, and I think about the power of like where media gets to shine its light, I'm like, how do we shine the light on some of the things that we can fuel in the system? And like good stories, I feel like are not the thing that people read all the time. So what is the balance there of reporting out on the problem, but like a pathway that is being able to bring forward? And I actually don't know the answer to that. Like that's on y'all to figure out. But as I lifted, I'm like, how do we empower like legislators to learn more? How do we give legislators cover? Because there's progress on this end, but these things still have to be addressed and these things are unacceptable, right? And so how do we do that? And I think a lot of what I'll share is like nuance matters here, and nuance matters a lot. And when by the time something gets to the point where it's considered newsworthy, sometimes there's a lot of emotion that comes with it because a child has been, died, or a child has been done very wrong. And so we have to tell the story, but how do we tell the story so that it actually also helps move some of the other components that are critical for systems reform? So I want to share like one last story before we go off record. When I think about some of the things here, this is my father. Got connected with him again got connected with him for the first time at 14 via phone. That's my sister's mother. And on his side of the family, he had a lot of folks who lived in New York City, and I lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I was about 26 when I got the phone call while I was visiting New York City that they were having a family reunion. And so my sister's like, do you want to go? And I'm like, it's 3 hours from now. She's just like, can I get a therapy session or two? Like, you just don't show up to a whole bunch of people's family reunion without any prep, but I did. And I got there, I raced over to Harlem, and while I was there, it was a very intense experience, right? Like I'm walking through the park, trying to figure out which families ours, finally arrive. People were very nice, accepting. And as I was there about 90 minutes in, I really just, like everything changed because I discovered that I had 4 aunts and uncles who were foster adopted parents for longer than I had been alive. And so at this point, I'm stunned by the fact that you had all these people who were always, who were related to me, who could have taken me in, but it didn't happen. And I literally pulled out my phone and GPS to my last foster home, and it was 58 miles away. And so when I think about what are the stories that help initiate and push reform, it's the hypocrisy of the system itself, right? Like we have these myths that the children who are in the system are there because of abuse, that they don't have anyone that they can go live with. And these stories are just not true. And now we're starting to see evidence of how some of these things are just not true. And I asked myself, how did we get here? And back in 1998, in July, this sentence is consistent with all of my case plans from July 16th, 1998, which is no viable resource for transfer of guardianship. And so this narrative became the truth for every worker who read my file. And so there was a set of questions, a set of things that they just didn't dig into. And that's why, there was an effort to go and say, well, who's on your father's side? Who can we go talk to? Because I could have been raised in a very different situation. And so when I think about the power of story sharing, it's like this, I got to write an op-ed and got to push this forward. And like, that's been the basis of us being able to like start to have some voice in what's happening in kin and how do we really lead in there. But what's most important is that it's not about the individual story, but when your story is like literally to the point where it's like not as unique because there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who are having the similar experience, like that's when you know that there's something systematic that needs to be changed, right? Because there are bad things, like life is full of bad things, let's just be honest, right? Like bad things happen. And the question becomes, when is it actually a systemic issue? And so how do we start to lean into those moments even more? So I want to wrap up here with this part of the presentation and just saying, I think narrative sharing for where we're at, we have a whole part of the, our sector that's in its infancy, which is prevention. People don't know what in the world prevention means. Does it mean prevent coming into care? Does it mean prevent bad things happening in the future for this child and this family's life, right? And so how we tell this narrative is going to influence how people think about it. And how they think about it is how they will implement their practices and their policies. And so I'm super excited. And I know one of the things that we are going to be investing in and digging deeper into is going to be what is the narrative making and the sense making that we need to be making in terms of prevention, right? Secondly, I think when it comes down to understanding kin is what is the power of, yes, people you're related to, but also people that you've known, right? And how they've stepped in. Imagine you as a parent, and the reality is like if something happened to you and your child, and a CPS worker was the first one to pick your child up from school because something happened to you, there is no guarantee whatsoever that your child will be placed with your sibling, with an extended cousin, with your parents. Like that is now the state's choice. And so as we think about what are the stories and understanding that we need to have here, like I'm excited about what this means. There's a lot of unanswered questions there.